The cage smelled like rust and damp earth. It sat in the middle of a dimly lit trading post, where beings from across the galaxy bartered for weapons, spices, and slaves. She was one of them, a blue-skinned girl with long, tangled blonde hair, her body wrapped in worn-out armor that once belonged to a warrior race. But now, she was worthless. Not because she was weak, but because no one saw her worth. Her captors had tried to sell her many times, but buyers turned their noses up at her. She's broken, they'd say. Useless. Not even worth feeding. They sneered at her, mocked her silent defiance. Other slaves wailed and pleaded for a chance at freedom, but she never begged. Not once. That made her dangerous in the eyes of those who dealt in flesh. A slave who did not break was of no use to them. Then, one day, a human arrived. He wasn't like the others who walked the market with arrogance, treating it like a playground for their power. No, this man was different. His clothes were simple, scuffed boots, a faded jacket, and a weary look in his eyes. He walked past the gold, past the fine silk and rare jewels, past the cages full of exotic creatures. And then, he stopped in front of her. For the first time in what felt like eternity, she raised her eyes to look at someone. The human met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Was it pity? No. Curiosity? Maybe. But there was something else, something she had never seen in any buyer before: respect. How much for her? The human asked. The slaver, a hulking creature covered in scales and greed, laughed. That one? Worthless. Take her for a handful of credits. I just want her gone. The human didn't haggle. He simply tossed a few credits onto the table, unlatched the cage, and held out a hand. She stared at it. No one had ever offered her their hand before. She didn't trust him, but she had nothing left to lose. So, she reached out, skin brushing against his calloused palm, and stepped out of her prison. As they walked through the market, the weight of chains no longer clanking against her wrists, she kept waiting for the trick. For him to shove her back into another cage, to claim her as property. But he didn't. He led her to a ship, a rusted, well-worn vessel that looked like it had seen 1,000 battles, and wordlessly gestured for her to enter. She hesitated at the threshold. Why? She finally asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. The human turned, studying her for a moment. Because you deserve better than that cage. It was the first time anyone had ever said she deserved anything at all. Inside the ship, the air smelled of metal and engine oil, familiar and strangely comforting. The human handed her a ration pack and gestured toward a seat. She took it cautiously, unwrapping the food with slow, deliberate movements. It had been so long since she had eaten something that wasn't scraps tossed at her feet. He sat across from her, leaning back in his chair. Name's Carter. You. She hesitated. Her name had been stripped from her when she was captured, reduced to nothing more than a number to be sold. She barely remembered it herself. Don't have one. Carter's brow furrowed, but he didn't push. Then we'll find one for you. Silence settled between them. Not the kind of silence that came from fear, but the kind that came from two souls trying to figure out what came next. Where are we going? She asked after a while. Somewhere safe, Carter said. Somewhere you can decide what to do with your life. She didn't know what that meant. No one had ever given her a choice before. But as the ship rumbled to life and the stars stretched before them, for the first time in forever, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. And that terrified her more than anything. The hum of the ship's engines filled the small cabin, a rhythmic, almost comforting sound. She sat across from Carter, studying him in silence. He was different from the others. He didn't order her around, didn't treat her like something he owned. And that unsettled her more than captivity ever had. You don't talk much, huh? Carter finally said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. She tensed. Words had always been dangerous. Speaking had earned her punishment before. But this time, there was no whip waiting, no cruel laughter mocking her. Just a man watching her with a quiet patience she didn't understand. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Carter let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Nothing. She frowned. That wasn't possible. Everyone wanted something. You bought me, she pointed out, her eyes narrowing. People don't buy things for nothing. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. You weren't a thing in that cage. You were a prisoner. I got you out. That's it. She had spent her entire existence waiting for a catch, a cruel twist to reveal itself. And yet, nothing came. He didn't demand loyalty. He didn't tell her where to sit or when to speak. He didn't treat her like property. And that terrified her. What now? She asked, because the unknown was somehow worse than captivity. Now, we figure out what you want to do, Carter said simply. You ever been anywhere besides that cage? She shook her head. The galaxy was vast, filled with wonders and horrors she had only ever heard whispers of. To be given the choice to decide where to go, what to do, was a weight she wasn't prepared to carry. Carter must have sensed her hesitation because he pushed himself up and stretched. We'll stop at a station in a few days. You'll be free to go if you want. Or stay. Up to you. Freedom. The word had no meaning to her. She had always been defined by what others wanted of her. A slave. A prisoner. A tool. If she wasn't any of those, then what was she? She stared out the viewport as the stars blurred past, endless and untouchable. Her fingers curled into fists as a war raged inside her. She could leave. Disappear into the void, start over. But start over as what? Someone with no name, no past, no future. Or she could stay. She didn't trust him. But for the first time, she wanted to. And that was almost as dangerous as captivity itself. Carter didn't push her for answers. He let the silence sit between them, waiting. And for once, she wasn't afraid of it. She had time now. Time to decide what she wanted to become. And that was a terrifying, exhilarating thing. The space station loomed in the distance, a metallic giant adrift in the cold void. Its lights flickered like distant stars, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Carter maneuvered the ship into the docking bay, his movements practiced, almost effortless. She sat in the co-pilot's chair, tense, her mind warring with itself. Freedom. It was just beyond the airlock. She had spent years trapped, owned, reduced to nothing. And now, with her first real chance to escape, she hesitated. Her fingers curled against her knees, digging into the fabric of her worn-out clothes. She had nowhere to go, no name, no past she wanted to keep. But Carter had given her something she hadn't had in years. Choice. You sure about this? Carter asked, his voice steady but gentle. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes on the controls as if giving her space to decide on her own. She swallowed hard, glancing at the station beyond the viewport. The docking bay bustled with figures of all shapes and sizes, mercenaries, traders, drifters. She could blend in, disappear, start fresh. But what would she be? Another nameless soul lost to the chaos? What if I don't belong anywhere? She whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Carter finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. Then we figure it out. Together. She exhaled, shaking her head. Why do you care? A shadow flickered across his face, something old and haunted. Because someone once gave me a chance when I didn't deserve it. And it changed everything. She searched his face for deception, for the cruel trick she had come to expect. But there was none. Just quiet sincerity. The airlock hissed open, the final step to freedom laid bare before her. She stood but didn't move forward. Not yet. Carter didn't push. He simply grabbed his coat and stepped down the ramp, blending into the crowd. He wasn't waiting for her to follow. He had left the decision entirely to her. She could run. Or she could stay. A heavy silence settled in her chest. The answer should have been easy. But nothing was ever easy. She took a deep breath and stepped off the ship. The station was alive with noise, shouts, laughter, the hum of machinery. She kept her head down, her instincts screaming to be invisible. Carter moved ahead, not looking back, giving her the space she didn't know she needed. A group of slavers lingered by a docked transport, their laughter sharp, cruel. She recognized the insignia on their uniforms. The same kind worn by the ones who had caged her. Her stomach clenched. You all right? Carter had stopped, his voice quieter now, careful. She forced a nod. But the truth was, she didn't know. Freedom wasn't just about leaving a cage. It was about choosing what to do next. And as she looked at Carter, this strange human who had given her the first real choice of her life, she realized she wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. I think I'll stick around, she said, and for the first time in years, she meant it. The space station became a temporary home, but it was never meant to be a destination. It was a place to pause, to think, to decide. And that's exactly what she did. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, she settled into a strange kind of normal. She worked odd jobs, learned the rhythms of a life not bound by chains, and for the first time, she had choices. Real choices. Carter never pressured her, never asked for anything. He was simply there, a quiet presence, a steady force when she needed it. She had spent so much of her life waiting for the next blow, the next betrayal, that trusting someone felt impossible. But Carter never wavered. He didn't offer empty promises or false hope. He just gave her space to become whoever she wanted to be. And then, one day, she realized she knew exactly who that was. She wasn't just someone who had been caged. She wasn't just a survivor. She was something more. So when Carter prepped his ship for departure, she made her decision. "I want to go with you," she said, standing by the ramp as the station bustled behind her. Carter gave her a long, considering look. "You sure?" She nodded. "I don't want to run. I want to fight. For others like me. For people who don't have a choice yet." A small, knowing smile tugged at his lips. "Then let's go." The ship roared to life, and as they left the station behind, she felt something lift from her chest. She had left her chains in that cage. And now, she was finally free, not just in body, but in spirit. She wasn't running anymore. She was choosing. And that made all the difference. The moral freedom isn't just about escaping a cage. It's about deciding what to do with that freedom. It's about forging a path, choosing who to become, and refusing to let the past define the future. Because in the end, true strength isn't found in survival alone, it's in what you choose to fight for after. She had been sold for nothing. But now, she knew her worth. And she would never let anyone take that from her again.